You said I was the wrong woman." Susanna Langston's voice came out low and steady, steadier than she felt, steadier than any woman had a right to sound when her whole world was crumbling into the red Arizona dust beneath her boots. She stood in the doorway of the Finley ranch house, her traveling bag hanging from her hand, her dark hair loose around her shoulders where it had come unpinned in the wind that screamed down from the canyon. The oil lamp on the table threw gold light across Dexter Finley's face, and she watched him flinch, watched the muscle in his jaw tighten like a wire being wound too far. "I said no such thing," he said, but his voice was hollow and they both knew it for the lie it was. "Your exact words." Susanna set the bag down on the porch boards with a deliberate thud. She would not cry. She had promised herself that much when she stepped off the stage in Redrock 3 weeks ago, a stranger in a strange territory, and she would keep that promise now even if keeping it felt like swallowing broken glass. "You told Deputy Harlan, and I heard it through the kitchen window, that I was the wrong woman, that whoever wrote that letter, whoever answered your advertisement, you had expected somebody different. You expected Clara Whitmore." The name landed between them like a stone into still water. Dexter crossed the room in 3 long strides and stopped at the threshold, so close she could see the dust on his collar, the tiredness carved into the lines around his eyes. He was 32 years old and he looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "Susanna, do not." She held up one hand. "I have been the wrong woman before, Dexter. I was the wrong woman in St. Louis when my father's business failed, and I became a liability instead of a dowry. I was the wrong woman in Denver when Reverend Aldis decided the congregation needed someone who came without a history. I have been wrong and wrong and wrong again, and I am finished being apologized to while someone explains to me why I do not fit their particular shape of need." She picked up the bag. "I will be on the morning stage." And that was when Dexter Finley said it, quietly, the way a man says something he has been thinking for a long time and is only now letting out into the open air where it cannot be taken back. "She was the wrong woman at the right moment," he said. "That is what I told Harlan. I said Clara Whitmore would have been the wrong woman at the right moment, the woman my father chose, the woman everyone in this county expected me to marry. And then you walked off that stage and I thought that made you exactly right." Susanna stood very still in the lantern-lit doorway of a house she barely knew and listened to the wind, and tried to understand what was happening to her heart. It had all begun 6 weeks earlier in a city 600 miles away, and it had begun, like most things that changed a life completely, with a piece of paper. The city was St. Louis, Missouri in the autumn of 1878, and Susanna Langston was 26 years old, alone in a boarding house on Chestnut Street, and she was not desperate, she told herself. She was practical. Desperation was what her landlady, Mrs. Elbert, called it, pressing thin lips together whenever Susanna came downstairs to check the mail. Practicality was what Susanna called the careful logic she had applied to her situation. She had $2.63, a small trunk of respectable clothing, a talent for cooking and bookkeeping that had not yet managed to translate into permanent employment, and a letter of introduction from a minister who had since retired to Ohio. St. Louis in 1878 had no particular interest in single women of modest means who lacked both family connections and the willingness to take work that would compromise their dignity. So she had opened the newspaper to the section near the back, the section that Mrs. Elbert would have called scandalous, and which Susanna chose to consider straightforwardly transactional, and she had read the advertisements. There were perhaps a dozen. Some were clearly written by lonely men who had not seen a woman in so long that their descriptions of what they wanted read more like prayers than practical requests. Some were clearly fraudulent, and Susanna had enough hard-won experience with fraud to recognize it quickly. But one, near the bottom of the column, was written in a plain and careful hand that suggested either education or at least the effort of it, and it said the following: rancher in Arizona Territory, 32, widowed, honest means, seeks wife of sound character and steady disposition. No beauty required. Willingness to work required. No romantic illusions. Write to D. Finley, Redrock, Arizona Territory. No romantic illusions. She had laughed, which was the first genuine laugh she had managed in 3 weeks, and she had taken out her writing paper and written back. She wrote that she was 26, that she was healthy, that she had worked as a bookkeeper for 2 years and before that as a cook's assistant, that she had no family to speak of, that she had a sound character as far as she could assess her own character, and that she had no romantic illusions whatsoever. She did not describe herself as beautiful, because she was not beautiful in the conventional sense. She had a long, serious face and dark eyes that people sometimes found unsettling, and she was tall for a woman, almost 5 feet and 7 inches, and she had been told all of this enough times that she had moved past being wounded by it into a kind of clear-eyed acceptance. She told him none of this because he had said no beauty required, and she took him at his word. She sent the letter and expected nothing, and 2 weeks later she received a reply. It was brief. It said, "Your letter was straight and I appreciate straight. Stage to Redrock runs Tuesdays. There will be room and board and a fair wage while matters are decided. The fare is enclosed. D. Finley." $3.40 in the envelope. Enough for the fare with a little extra. She packed her trunk, paid Mrs. Elbert what she owed her, took the stage east to connect with the line that ran down into the territory, and arrived in Redrock, Arizona, on a Tuesday afternoon in late October of 1878, stepping into a wall of heat that surprised her because it was October, and she had expected something cooler, though she would learn that the territory laughed at expectations like that. Redrock was not a large town. It had a main street with perhaps 15 structures of varying quality, a livery stable, a general store operated by a man named Gunderson who also served as the informal postmaster, a small adobe building that functioned as a sheriff's office and jail, a saloon called the Red Ace that was perfectly audible from 3 blocks away, and a church whose whitewash was peeling at the corners in the particular way that heat and wind conspire to peel whitewash in that country. There was a schoolhouse at the edge of town. There was a water trough near the livery that was visited regularly by horses and occasionally by dogs. Dexter Finley was not at the stage depot when she arrived. There was, instead, a boy of about 16 named Tamaz who worked at the livery, and who came to tell her that Mr. Finley had sent him, and that there was a wagon, and that Mr. Finley apologized for not being there himself because there was a fence situation on the north pasture that had required his immediate attention. The boy said all of this very formally, clearly repeating it as instructed, and Susanna thanked him and climbed onto the wagon seat beside him with her trunk in the back, and they drove out of Redrock on a packed dirt road that wound through country so raw and vast it made her feel very small and very awake at the same time. The Finley Ranch was 4 miles outside of town. It was larger than she had imagined from the advertisement, which had suggested honest means without specifying what means those were. The main house was built of adobe and timber, solid and weathered, with a wide covered porch that ran the length of the front. There were 2 bunkhouses for the hands, a large stable, several corrals, a cookhouse that was separate from the main house, and in the distance a series of low hills that caught the late afternoon light in shades of copper and amber that she found, despite herself, genuinely beautiful. She was standing in the yard with her trunk at her feet, shading her eyes against the sun, when Dexter Finley rode in from the north. She had not allowed herself to form expectations about him, either, because she had learned early in life that expectations were debts you paid later with disappointment. But she watched him ride in and she registered, with the same clear-eyed practicality she applied to most things, that he was a large man on a large horse, that he had dark blonde hair gone dusty with trail grime, that he moved in the saddle with the unself-conscious ease of a person who had spent most of their life on horseback, and that when he swung down from the animal and turned to face her, his eyes were a pale gray-green that she had not expected, and that she found, briefly and inconveniently, rather striking. "Miss Langston," he said. He did not smile, but he removed his hat. "Mr. Finley," she said, "you have a fence situation resolved." Something shifted in his expression. "Neighbor's cattle got through again, third time this month." He looked at her steadily. "Was the ride out all right?" "Fine." She glanced at the house. "You said room and board while matters are decided. I would like to understand what matters and what the deciding process looks like if you're willing to explain it." He looked at her for a moment the way a person looks at something that has surprised them without alarming them. "Direct," he said. "You said you appreciated direct in your letter," she said. "I thought I would continue in that vein." "I did say that." He picked up one end of her trunk. "Come inside." The house was clean in the way of a place maintained by a person who respected order without being attached to comfort. There were practical furnishings, nothing ornate, good quality but worn. There was a stone fireplace that was clearly the center of the main room. There was a kitchen off the back that was better equipped than she had expected. There were 2 bedrooms, one clearly his, one clearly prepared for her with a bed and a washstand and a hooked rug on the floor. There was a small desk in the main room with an account ledger on it that was, she noticed as she passed, written in the same plain, careful hand as the advertisement. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Dolan, left last spring," he said, setting down the trunk. "She went to live with her daughter in Tucson. The cooking and the house accounts have been managed by my foreman Cal and by myself, and neither of us is suited to it." He paused. "I need someone who can run the house and keep the books. I need someone permanent. What I am proposing is that you stay here in the spare room with your own privacy respected absolutely, and that you take the measure of the place and I take the measure of you, and at the end of 30 days we discuss whether a permanent arrangement is appropriate." He met her eyes. "A married arrangement. I will not dress it up in different language." "No," she said. "I would prefer you don't dress it up." She set her small bag down on the bed. "And if either of us decides the arrangement is not appropriate, then I give you a fair wage for the 30 days and stage fare to wherever you want to go." It was the fairest offer anyone had made her in years. She told him so, and he looked slightly uncomfortable at that, the way some people do when plain honesty grazes a nerve they did not know they had. She settled in. She was good at settling in, at making herself useful quickly, which was a skill born of having had to remake her life more than once. By the end of her first week, she had organized the kitchen, identified 3 significant errors in the previous 6 months of accounts, begun cooking meals that the ranch hands discussed among themselves with something approaching reverence, and established a cordial but carefully bounded working relationship with Dexter Finley that involved a great deal of practical conversation and almost nothing personal. He was not an easy man to know. That was the truth of it, and she knew it early. He was not cold, exactly. He said thank you without prompting. He was considerate about her privacy. He did not drink in the house. And on the 3rd day, when she cut her hand on a knife while butchering a chicken, he appeared from nowhere with a clean bandage and tied it himself with the quiet competence of someone who had patched up cuts before, though he was careful not to touch her more than was necessary, and stepped back the moment the knot was tied. But there was a wall in him, careful and high, and she recognized it because she had her own version of the same architecture. He had been married before. Tamaz had told her this on the wagon ride out, in the guileless way of very young people who do not yet understand that some information is loaded. Her name had been Ruth. She had died 2 winters ago of a fever that moved through the valley and took 3 people in a week. Dexter had been alone since then. Susanna did not ask him about Ruth. That was a door he had not opened, and she respected closed doors. What she learned about him, she learned sideways. The way you learn about someone when you live in the same house and share meals and work near each other through the long hours of a day. She learned that he read. There was a shelf of books in the main room, well worn, Everything from a cattleman's almanac to a collection of poetry that she pretended not to notice, because it did not fit the image he projected, and she had the sense it was private. She learned that he was scrupulously fair with his hands, that when a young wrangler named Ethan made a costly mistake with a gate and lost 3 horses, Dexter docked his pay fairly but did not fire him and did not humiliate him. She learned that he was respected in Redrock, even by people who clearly found him difficult, which she thought was the more honest form of respect. She learned that he had a dark past in the sense that he had once been close with a man named Gerald Voss, who had turned out to be something other than what he appeared, and that this had cost Dexter something she could not yet quantify but could feel in the careful way he approached trust. She learned that he watched her. Not in a threatening way, and not even in an obvious way, but she was observant herself, and she caught it. The way his attention tracked her when she moved through the room, the way he would pause in whatever he was doing when she spoke to someone else, as though he was filing information away. She did not know what to do with that, and so she did nothing with it, which was the sensible approach. 2 weeks in, the first complication arrived. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she arrived in a buckboard driven by her father, Hector Whitmore, who owned the largest neighboring ranch and was clearly under the impression that things between Clara and Dexter Finley were still understood. Clara was 23 years old, blonde-haired and pretty in a sunlit, conventional way, and she had the manner of a person who had been told all their life that they were charming, which had made them genuinely charming without requiring them to work at it. She was not unkind. Susanna looked at her carefully and made that assessment honestly. Clara Whitmore was not unkind. She was simply a person who had a thing she wanted and was accustomed to getting things she wanted. The thing she wanted was Dexter Finley. Susanna gathered this from the way Clara looked at the house when she came inside, the small proprietary assessment of it, and from the way Hector Whitmore spoke to Dexter, the heavy-handed implication in his pleasantries, the assumption that the Finley Ranch and the Whitmore Ranch would eventually be folded together by a marriage that had been imagined if not promised. Susanna served coffee and listened and kept her expression neutral and polite. After the Whitmores left, Dexter stood on the porch for a long time looking out at the hills, and Susanna washed the cups and kept to the kitchen until he came inside. "I should explain," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway. "You don't owe me an explanation," she said, drying a cup. "No," he said, "but I will give you one anyway." He came and sat at the kitchen table, which was where he sat when something was on his mind, she had noticed, rather than the main room. The kitchen meant the conversation was practical, not formal. "My father and Hector Whitmore were close. Before my father died, there was an understanding that I would marry Clara. I never agreed to it explicitly. But I never refused it explicitly either, and Hector has been carrying it forward on his own momentum ever since. And Clara," Susanna said. "Clara would not be unhappy about it," he said, which was a careful way to say what he meant without saying it more bluntly. "But I wrote that advertisement because I had decided the understanding was finished. I was not as clear about that to Hector as I should have been." "That seems like something you should be clear about," Susanna said. "Yes," he said, "it does." She put down the cup. "For what it's worth, and I recognize my position makes my opinion self-interested here, so weight it accordingly. I think the kindest thing to do is the direct thing, for Clara's sake as much as yours." He looked at her for a moment with that assessing gray-green gaze. "Your opinion is noted," he said. He said it seriously, without condescension, and it occurred to her that this might be the first time in her adult life that a man had said those words to her and meant them. The trouble did not come from Clara herself. It came from Gerald Voss. She heard the name first from Cal, the foreman, who was a weathered man of 50 with a mustache that he managed with the seriousness of a civic project, and who was on the whole the most straightforward person on the property. Cal mentioned Voss in passing, the way you mention something you wish you had not mentioned, and then tried to move past it. But Susanna was a bookkeeper by training and pattern recognition was her nature, and she had already noticed certain things in the accounts that she had not yet raised with Dexter, certain payments marked simply as settled, going back about 3 years, that did not correspond to any supplier or service she could identify. Gerald Voss had been a business partner of Dexter's. He had also been, as it turned out, a man who had used that partnership to funnel cattle from the Finley operation into a rustling ring that operated across 3 counties. Dexter had discovered this 2 years ago, shortly after Ruth's death, when he was in the worst place of his life, and the discovery had hit him at the worst possible time. Voss had been arrested. He had spent 8 months in the territorial prison in Yuma and been released on account of a legal error in the documentation of his case, a fact that Dexter clearly still found almost physically painful to discuss. The payments in the accounts were the restitution he had been slowly making to men who had been downstream of Voss's fraudulent dealings, paying debts that were not technically his, but that he felt, in his particular sense of moral architecture, were connected to his failure to see what was happening under his own roof. She found all of this out not from Dexter but from the accounts, and from Cal, and from Gunderson, the storekeeper in town who talked while he was weighing flour and seemed not to notice he was doing it. What she found out from Dexter was what happened after Voss was released. She found it out in the second week when she came back from town on a Tuesday afternoon and found Dexter at the kitchen table with a letter in front of him and his jaw set in that wire-tight way, and when he heard her come in he turned and said, without preamble, "Voss is in the territory again." She set down the flour she was carrying. "What does he want?" "To give the impression that we have unfinished business," Dexter said. "He will come here. He has done it before, after the arrest, before the trial. He came here twice to make certain proposals that I refused. He wants access to the water rights on the South Pasture. He made my father a verbal agreement about them years ago that was never put in writing, and now he is claiming the agreement should transfer to him." He folded the letter. "He is the kind of man who accumulates these small supposed entitlements and then uses them collectively as leverage." "Dark past," Susanna said quietly, not intending to say it aloud. "Yes," Dexter said, "that is accurate. What will you do?" "Tell him no again." He stood up. "The water rights are not his. The verbal agreement was my father's to make or not make, and it was never made in terms that could be enforced, and I will not be leveraged." He paused at the doorway. "I want you to know about it because if he comes here when I'm not here, which he is likely to try, I want you to know not to let him inside and not to discuss anything with him. He is persuasive in ways that are not always obvious." "I have experience with men who are persuasive in ways that are not always obvious," she said. "I will be careful." He nodded. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "How are the accounts?" She had been waiting for a moment to raise this. "I have questions," she said. "I expected you would. The payments marked settled, going back to 1875, are my business," he said. Then, after a pause that she recognized as the pause of a man recalibrating, "Are my business that I am willing to explain to you. Not tonight, soon." "All right," she said. She meant it. She had learned that some things needed to be approached at their own pace, like wild animals or river crossings, and that the worst thing you could do was rush them. That evening, unexpectedly, he stayed at the kitchen table after dinner and talked. Not about the accounts and not about Voss, but about the ranch, about what it had been when his father ran it, and what he wanted it to be, about the water issues in the valley that were becoming serious as more settlers arrived, and the existing allocations began to strain, about a new breed of cattle he had been reading about that might do better in the territory heat. She listened and asked the occasional question and found herself, without having planned to, describing the farm outside St. Louis where she had spent her childhood before her father's business moved them to the city, and what it had been like to know animals and land before knowing ledgers and city streets. He listened to that the way he listened to most things, completely, without the half-attention she had become accustomed to from most people who asked about her past. He said, "You miss it." "I miss the sense that the work I did had a direct and visible consequence," she said. "In the city, You keep accounts and you see numbers change. Here, she glanced toward the window, the dark hills and the wide star-scattered sky beyond. The consequence is that actual animals live or die. Actual land produces or fails. It is more frightening and also more real. Yes, he said, that is exactly it. They sat for a moment in the kind of quiet that is not uncomfortable. Then the lamp between them guttered in a draught from the window, and they both reached to steady it at the same moment, and his hand closed briefly over hers on the lamp base, and they both went very still, and then he released her hand and stood up and said good night in a voice that was perfectly controlled and went to his room, and Susanna sat at the kitchen table for a long time afterward, looking at the lamp flame. She told herself firmly that she was being practical and that nothing had happened, which was almost entirely true. Gerald Voss arrived at the ranch on a Thursday when Dexter was in town at the sheriff's office about a property dispute with another neighbor. Susanna saw him coming up the road from the window where she was working on the accounts, and she recognized from his manner and the quality of his horse and tact that this was not a man who was here to ask for directions. She had also, in the 3 days since Dexter had warned her, done what she always did when she needed to understand something. She had gathered information. She had asked Cal careful questions. She had listened in Gunderson's store. She had read enough of the documented history in the ranch, accounts to construct a reasonably clear picture of Gerald Voss. He was 40 perhaps, with a rider's build and a face that had learned to arrange itself in expressions of reasonableness. He was clean-shaven and well-dressed for the territory. He removed his hat when she opened the door, and he smiled at her with practiced warmth and said he was looking for Dexter. "He's in town," Susanna said. "Can I take a message?" "I'd rather wait," Voss said, "if that's all right." "He may be some time," she said. "I'd be happy to pass a message along." He looked at her with a shift of focus that she recognized, the recalibration from treating her as an obstacle to treating her as a potential tool. "You must be the woman from St. Louis," he said. Dexter mentioned he was expecting someone. She doubted Dexter had mentioned her to Voss at all. "I help with the house," she said pleasantly. "Shall I tell him you called?" "I'll wait," Voss said again more firmly and stepped toward the door. "I'm afraid I can't invite you inside," Susanna said, and her voice was very pleasant and very clear, and she did not move from the doorway. "Mr. Finley is particular about who comes into the house in his absence. I'm sure you understand." A flicker of something moved across Voss's face, not anger exactly, but the ancestor of anger quickly controlled. "We're old friends," he said. "I'm sure you are," she said. "I'll let him know you called." "It was Mr. Voss, wasn't it? Gerald Voss," he stilled. She held his gaze. The fact that she had named him, that she knew who he was, communicated precisely what she intended it to communicate. That she was not uninformed, that the approach of treating her as someone who could be managed easily had a flaw in it, and that she was not going to be moved. He left. She watched him go until he was back on the road and moving toward town, and then she closed the door and stood for a moment in the cool interior of the house and let out a slow, quiet breath. When Dexter came back that afternoon, she told him about Voss's visit, and he listened without interrupting, and at the end he said, "You held the door." "Yes," she said. "He can be convincing," Dexter said. He was looking at her steadily. "He gets in through small openings. A moment of sympathy, a reasonable-seeming claim. I know the type," Susanna said. "I worked for 2 years for a man in St. Louis who was exactly that type, and I watched him take money from 6 people before anyone called it what it was. I have a reliable instinct for it now." Something in Dexter's expression softened in a way she had not seen before. Not the calculated softening of a person managing their presentation, but the actual easing of something held too long. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it the way people mean things when they are saying more than the words. "He'll come back," she said. "Yes," Dexter said, "he will, and when he does I would rather he found me here." He paused. "I would rather you weren't here alone when he comes." "I can manage myself," she said. "I know that," he said. "That's not what I meant." He looked at her again with that expression she was beginning to file into its own category, separate from the other ways he looked at people, and then he said, "The accounts. The settled payments. I'll explain them now if you have time." She had time. He explained for almost an hour, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with the account ledger between them, and she listened to the whole story, the partnership with Voss, the signs he had missed or refused to see, the discovery after Ruth died, the arrest and the trial and the release, and the 2 years of quietly making right what he could. He spoke without self-pity and without excusing himself, which she found, in a way she had not entirely anticipated, intensely moving. It was not the story of a weak man who had been fooled. It was the story of a man who had trusted and been betrayed, had looked at the betrayal honestly, and had decided that the people who had been hurt deserved better from him even if the law did not require it. "I should have seen it earlier," he said at the end. "The people who deceive us deliberately spend a great deal of effort making sure we don't see it early," she said. "That is the essential mechanism of deception." He looked at her. "Are you forgiving me for something I didn't ask you to forgive me for? I'm pointing out that the blame you're carrying is significantly larger than the portion that actually belongs to you," she said. "What you do with that information is your business." He was quiet for a moment. "You are not what I expected," he said. "You said no romantic illusions," she said. "I assumed that included the illusion that people conform to expectations." He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile without reservation, without the slight holding back that she had grown accustomed to reading in him, and the effect was startling in the way that unexpected things are startling, the way a light coming on in a dark room changes everything about the room. She looked back at the account ledger and pretended to be absorbed by a column of figures, which she absolutely was not. The 30 days passed. They passed in the way that time passes when you are so fully occupied that you do not notice it accumulating, and then you turn around and it is gone. They were occupied days, genuinely. There was the house to run and the accounts to manage. There were negotiations with a supplier in Tucson that Susanna handled by letter with what Dexter called an alarming amount of effectiveness. There was a difficult conversation that Dexter had with Hector Whitmore in which he made his intentions clear, and which Susanna learned about second-hand from Cal, but which clearly cost Dexter something in terms of social ease in the valley. There was a fence repair on the south pasture that required everyone including Susanna to spend 2 days in the field, and which was the first time she had done manual outdoor labor in years, and which she found exhausting and unexpectedly satisfying. There were evenings at the kitchen table. There were conversations that wandered far from the practical into territory she had not expected: books, and the particular kind of conversation that is possible when two people have both read something and have different and compatible things to say about it. There was the night it rained hard for the first time since she had arrived, and the rain thundered on the roof, and he came to check that her room was not leaking, and it was not, and they stood in the doorway between the main room and the hall for a moment with the sound of rain all around them, and she thought many things she did not say. Gerald Voss came back on the 28th day. He did not come to the house this time. He came to the corral where Dexter was working a young horse, and Susanna watched from the porch without going out because she understood that this particular conversation needed to happen without her, and without an audience if there was going to be any resolution. But she watched, the way you watch something that might turn dangerous. The conversation was long. She could not hear it, but she could read the shape of it in the two men's postures, the way Voss's apparent reasonableness kept encountering Dexter's very still, very resolved refusal. At one point Voss spread his hands in a gesture that was meant to convey injury, and Dexter turned back to the horse, which was the clearest possible signal. At another point something Voss said made Dexter turn around fast, and she saw his hands close, and she pushed off the porch rail because she was ready to walk over there. But then Dexter said something short and flat and Voss stepped back, and after another moment Voss walked back to his horse and rode out. Dexter stood by the corral for a while after Voss left, his hands on the top rail, his head down. Then he came back to the house. "What did he say that made you turn?" she asked. He paused. "He knew about the advertisement. He knew about you. He said things about the nature of what you were here for." He met her eyes directly. "Things that were intended to insult you and to imply that my judgment could not be trusted because I had brought a woman here off an advertisement in a newspaper. Things about your past." "What about my past?" Susanna said very quietly. "Things that were either false or taken so far out of context they amounted to false," Dexter said. "Voss does his homework when he wants leverage. He finds pieces of information and reassembles them into something useful." His jaw was set, but his voice was careful. "He mentioned a man in Denver, a reverend," she breathed. "Aldous," she said. "I told you I was dismissed from a congregation in Denver. I did not tell you the specifics. The specific is that Aldous, the reverend, accused me of stealing from the charity fund. The accusation was false. I was not charged and the matter was dropped. But the accusation was made, and in a small community it does not matter much whether the accusation is true or false." "I know," Dexter said. Cal checked. "Voss presented it to me as established fact. I know it is not." Susanna looked at him. "You checked before now." "3 weeks ago," he said. "When I first knew Voss was in the territory, I wanted to know what he might try to use." He held her gaze steadily. "I found nothing that changed my opinion. Cal knows people in Denver. The reputation there is that Aldous had debts of his own and needed someone to point to." She felt something release in her chest that she had not known was clenched. "You never mentioned it," she said. "It was not my information to raise with you," he said. "What Voss did with it was not something I was willing to let go past." She leaned against the kitchen table. "So he is hoping that by impugning my character he can make you doubt your own judgment and thereby make you more susceptible to his proposals about the water rights." "Yes." "And are you susceptible?" "No," he said simply and absolutely. "I am not." The 30th day arrived. It arrived in the form of a morning that was cooler than recent mornings, a band of cloud along the western horizon suggesting weather coming in, the smell of the desert before rain. Susanna made breakfast. Dexter ate without speaking more than usually. She thought she knew what was coming, and she had been thinking carefully about how she felt about it, and what she thought about how she felt about it. She thought she was more invested in the outcome than she had intended to be. She thought that was a practical problem she had not anticipated when she stepped off the stage in Redrock. This business of investment, of caring about whether a thing happened in a way that overrode the straightforward calculation. She thought that she had been right when she told him she had no romantic illusions, and that what she was feeling now was something categorically different from romantic illusions. It was the more dangerous and more solid thing of simply wanting something real to happen with a specific person whose specific qualities she had had 30 days to observe and consider. After breakfast he said, "I think we should talk." "I think so too," she said. They went to the main room, which was the formal territory, the sitting-down territory, and it felt more serious than the kitchen table. He sat across from her and was quiet for a moment, and she waited. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "More honest than advertisements allow." "Please," she said. "I wrote that advertisement because I needed what I described: practical help with the house and the accounts, someone who could run this place effectively. Those were genuine needs." He paused. "What I did not write in the advertisement was that Ruth's death left something in me that I was not sure could be repaired. Not grief, exactly. Ruth and we were well matched in a practical sense, and I mourned her honestly. But there was something else. The business with Voss happened just after she died, and those two things together built something in me that I did not entirely understand until recently." "What did they build?" she asked. "A conviction that my judgment about people was not to be trusted," he said. "That I had failed to see what was in front of me, and that opening myself up to being wrong about someone again would cost something I could not afford to lose." He was looking at the middle distance, not at her. "I wrote the advertisement for a housekeeper. I told myself that was the limit of it," I told myself the 30 days were a test of practical suitability and nothing more. Susanna sat very still. And then you arrived, he said, and you were not what the advertisement suggested. Not in the sense of being unsuitable, in the sense of being something I had not written down because I had not known to write for it. He met her eyes then. You are direct and honest in a way that is uncomfortable sometimes in the best way. You managed Voss better than I did when you were alone with him. You fixed errors in my accounts that I had been missing for months. You held the door. He paused. You read the poetry collection on the shelf and you have said nothing about it, but I have seen you looking at it. I moved it 6 inches to the right to dust the shelf, she said. I was hoping you hadn't noticed. I notice everything in this house, he said, and something in his voice was very quiet and very careful. Susanna, I am asking you to stay, not as a housekeeper, not as an arrangement. I am asking you to marry me, and I want it to be clear that I am asking you because of who you are specifically, not because 30 days have passed and I need to make a decision. I would not ask if I did not mean it entirely. She looked at him for a long moment. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask. When you said you had a conviction that your judgment about people could not be trusted, is that still true, or has 30 days changed that? He thought about it honestly, which was the thing about him she had come to rely on, the willingness to think about things honestly before speaking. I think it is still somewhat true, he said. I think I am still a man who will be cautious longer than is comfortable and who has a wall that takes a long time to come down. I am telling you this as a practical matter. I will not pretend it away. He paused. But I also think that I have more faith in my judgment than I did 30 days ago, because for 30 days I have watched you and found nothing to revise. That is the most cautiously romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, Susanna said. He almost smiled. I told you, no romantic illusions. No, she agreed. But I have found that reality, when it is genuinely good, is considerably better than illusions anyway. She said yes. She said it the same way she did most things, plainly and directly, and with full understanding of what she was agreeing to. And when she said it, the tension in his shoulders eased in a way she had not quite seen before, a release of something long held, and she thought that was the most honest response he could have given her, and she was glad to be the cause of it. They were married in the Redrock church 3 weeks later, on a Thursday, which was the day the circuit preacher came through the valley. The whitewash was still peeling at the corners, and the wind came through the gaps in the window frames, and Susanna wore her best dress, which was green calico, and she had done her hair carefully, and Cal stood up with them, and Tomas from the livery stood in the back with his hat in his hands, because he had apparently decided, he was invested in how this turned out. The preacher was a man named Brother Connors who moved through the territory like weather, and he read the service from memory because he had done it so many times, and he said the words over them with the matter-of-fact sincerity of a man who had seen enough of the world to take matrimony seriously. And when he said, "You may kiss your bride," Dexter looked at Susanna for a moment with an expression she had not seen before, something unguarded and genuine, and then he kissed her. Brief and careful and entirely real. Hector Whitmore did not come to the wedding, which was expected. Clara Whitmore sent a jar of preserves, which was unexpected and which Susanna thought showed a considerable quality of character, and she made a point of calling on Clara in town the following week and thanking her in person, and Clara was polite and a little wary and then warming by degrees, and Susanna thought that they might, in time, manage something like friendship. The trouble with Voss did not end with the wedding. Troubles of that variety did not end with ceremonies. In the second week of December, 1878, 6 weeks into their marriage, a fire started in one of the bunkhouses at 2 in the morning. Susanna woke to the smell of smoke and was on her feet before she was entirely conscious, and by the time she got to the yard, Dexter and Cal and 3 of the hands were already forming a bucket line from the water trough. 2 of the hands had been sleeping in the bunkhouse and got out, singed and shaken, but alive. The bunkhouse burned to its foundation before they had it controlled. In the cold gray morning after, Going through what remained, Cal found the remnants of what had been a lantern left in a position that no one would have placed it. Dexter went into Redrock that morning to speak to the sheriff, a man named Beaumont who was competent and careful, and who, when presented with the evidence, said the name Gerald Voss with the resigned air of a man for whom this was not a surprise. Voss was found 2 days later at a roadhouse 10 miles east of Redrock, which suggested either confidence or stupidity or both. Beaumont and his deputy brought him in. The case against him was not certain, but it was substantial, and Dexter was willing to testify, and 2 of the ranch hands were willing to testify, and Beaumont had developed his own documentation of Voss's activities in the territory over the past several years that painted a pattern that was difficult to dismiss. The trial was in February. Susanna attended every day of it, which Dexter had not asked her to do, and which she chose to do, because she thought her presence was a visible statement of something she was not willing to leave unstated. She sat in the back of the courtroom, straight-backed, and watched Gerald Voss's attorney try to construct a defense out of alternate possibilities and the inadequacy of direct evidence. She watched Dexter on the stand, answering questions in his direct, considered way that made it very clear to everyone in the room that he was telling the truth, and he knew the difference between what he knew and what he believed, and the distinction made him credible in a way that was difficult to undermine. Voss was convicted of arson and of the prior matters that Beaumont had documented, and sentenced to 3 years in the territorial prison at Yuma. When the verdict came down, Dexter turned from the front of the courtroom and looked at Susanna in the back of it, and she gave him a small, firm nod, and he gave her back the same, and it was not a dramatic gesture, but it was a shared one, the kind that means more for being quiet. On the drive home from Redrock after the verdict, they drove through country that was still cold and gold in the February afternoon, the winter light long and clear, and Dexter said, "It's done." "It is," she said. "I spent 2 years thinking it would never be fully done," he said. "Things like that have a way of outlasting their welcome," she said. He was quiet for a moment, the horses moving steadily through the light. "I want to say something," he said. "Say it." "When I wrote that advertisement," he said, "I was writing it as a transaction, something practical and clear and without the possibility of surprise. And then you arrived and you were practical and clear and also a surprise." He was looking at the road ahead, his hands easy on the reins. "I told Harlan once. I told him that Clara Whitmore would have been the wrong woman at the right moment. What I meant was that everyone expected that choice. My father expected it, Hector Whitmore expected it, the whole valley expected it, and it was the right time in the right circumstances, and she was exactly the wrong person for me specifically. And that you were a surprise, that you arrived when I was not expecting you, in circumstances I had not planned, and that made you exactly right." Susanna sat with that for a moment in the winter light. "You told me that on the night I was about to leave," she said, "the night I overheard you talking to Harlan. You were leaving," he said. "You picked up your bag. I watched you pick up that bag and I realized what I had not been saying clearly enough, in the way I have difficulty saying things that matter enough to frighten me. You are better at it than you think," she said. He glanced at her. "You think so?" "I have evidence," she said. "I keep careful records." He laughed, and the laugh was full and real and warmed the cold air between them, and she thought that she could very happily spend a considerable number of years collecting evidence of Dexter Finley's genuine happiness, and that this was not an illusion, romantic or otherwise. It was a plan, and she was good at plans. They came over the low rise in the road, and the ranch came into view below them. The house and the corrals and the rebuilt bunkhouse, the winter grass pale and gold around it, and the hills behind catching the last of the afternoon. And she thought that she had spent a very long time being the wrong woman in the wrong place, and that she had arrived here without expecting anything at all, which was perhaps the only way to arrive at something genuinely good, without the weight of expectations to distort it. Spring came to the valley like a slow, deliberate promise being kept. The dry grasses turned improbably green along the creek beds. The mesquite put out its small yellow flowers. The mornings came cooler and the afternoons came warm. And the light had a particular quality in those weeks between winter and true heat that Susanna found she loved with the particular affection you develop for the qualities of a place that has become yours. She was learning the ranch the way she had learned other things in her life carefully, thoroughly, with full attention. But she was also learning that learning a place you love is different from learning a place you are merely trying to master. There was joy in it, the unexpected pleasure of a life that had turned out to contain something she had not known she was hoping for. She rode every day now. This had begun in February when Dexter had said, with apparent casualness, that it was impractical for her not to be able to cover the property on horseback, and had put her on a small, mild-tempered sorrel mare he called Penny, and had spent 3 patient afternoons teaching her the fundamentals, which she had taken to with the same rapid, methodical competence she applied to most things. By April, she was riding the fence lines alone on Penny, which gave her a daily 2 hours of the kind of solitude that is restorative rather than lonely. Moving through country, she was daily learning to love in finer and finer detail. She had also taken it upon herself to resolve the water rights situation properly, which meant not merely relying on the dismissal of Voss's claims, but actually documenting the existing rights structure in writing, working with the county records in Redrock, and with a lawyer in Tucson named Mr. Barclay who had a reputation for thorough work in property matters. Dexter had raised an eyebrow when she told him she had written to Barclay, and she had raised one back at him, and he had said, "All right," in the tone of a man learning when to remove himself from the path of something determined, and the Finley water rights had been documented and filed by the end of March in a way that would not be open to challenge by anyone. She liked that. She liked the usefulness of it. She had been useful in her life before, but it had always been for other people's projects, other people's stakes, work that mattered to the person paying her in ways she was adjacent to but not part of. This was different. These were her stakes too. The ranch was hers too, in the legal sense that the marriage made it so, but more concretely in the sense that she was invested in it. She wanted it to do well. She cared when the cattle prices shifted, and when the water situation eased, and when a new hand turned out to be skilled and reliable. It was hers in the way that things are yours when you have poured your particular self into them. The evenings were her favorite part of the day. The evenings had acquired a rhythm that she had come to need, in the way you come to need things that are genuinely good. After dinner, if the weather was fine, they sat on the porch in the brief window between the end of the day's heat and the cooling of the night, and they talked or did not talk according to what the day had been, and sometimes he read and she worked on the accounts or letters, and sometimes they talked for a long time about everything and nothing, and sometimes they sat in the kind of comfortable silence that is its own form of communication. He was not an easy man in the sense of being uncomplicated. He was still the person who held things carefully and spoke slowly about things that mattered to him, and found it easier to show something than to say it. But she had learned his language, the quality of his silences, the specific uses of his restraint, the way certain expressions moved across his face when he was thinking something he had not yet decided to say. She knew when he was worried about the cattle or the water or the accounts in ways he had not raised with her. She knew when something she said had found a particular resonance. She knew the difference between the various qualities of his attention, which were distinguishable once you had been paying attention yourself for long enough. And she knew, with the same clear-eyed certainty she applied to most things, that he loved her. He had not said it. That was in the nature of things. But it was present in the particular way he attended to her, the small adjustments of care that he made without being asked, the second cup of coffee that appeared at her elbow when she was deep in the accounts, the way he checked the sorrel mare's shoes without mentioning it, The night she came in from a difficult afternoon in town, dealing with a supplier who had been condescending in ways she found freshly irritating each time she encountered them. And he looked at her face and said, quietly, "Hard afternoon." And when she said yes, he simply stayed close for the rest of the evening in the way of someone who understands that proximity is its own comfort. She said it first. It was May, and they were out by the south pasture checking the fence line together, which had become an occasional habit on Sunday mornings when the hands were off, and the property had its quiet, the specific empty piece of land on a morning with no pressing business. She had dismounted to look at a section of fence that was pulling loose from a post, and Dexter had come to stand beside her to assess the repair that was needed, and they were standing close together in the warm morning light, and she had been feeling it for weeks now with increasing intensity, and she thought, practically and clearly, that she was going to say it, because it was true and it was not lessened by being said. And she had been the wrong woman in the wrong place too many times to be afraid of being honest about something real. "I love you," she said. He went very still beside her. She looked up at him. He was looking at the fence. "I know that is not the way these things are supposed to arrive," she said, "in sequence or with appropriate ceremony, but I find I would rather say true things when they are true than manage the moment for effect." He looked at her then, and his expression was the one she had no name for, the one that existed in its own category. He raised one hand and touched her face briefly, with the same careful deliberateness he applied to important things, and then he said, "I love you." He said it like a man who had been holding a breath for a long time. I have been trying to work out how to say it. You said it first because you are better at saying true things than I am." "I have more practice," she said. "I have had to say a greater quantity of difficult true things in my life. It makes you less afraid of the smaller ones." "That is not a small one," he said. "No," she agreed. "It is not, which is why I am glad it's said." He kissed her then, in the warm May morning by the south fence, with the horses standing patiently nearby, and the hills in the distance, and the sky above them, the particular deep Arizona blue of a clear late spring day. And she kissed him back with the full and uncomplicated conviction of a person who has found, after a long time of being in the wrong places, exactly the right one. The summer was long and hot in the way of Arizona summers, which do not apologize for themselves, and they moved through it together in the full partnership of two people who had decided to be genuinely on each other's side. There were hard days, a drought that threatened the east pasture, a difficult negotiation with a cattle buyer from Tucson who tried to discount their price in ways that Susanna took very personally, and addressed in writing with such precision that Dexter said afterward that the man had looked genuinely afraid. But the hard days felt different now, felt workable, felt like challenges that belonged to both of them rather than to either one alone. In August, Susanna told Dexter she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning with the same directness she applied to important announcements, and watched his face do something she had not seen before, a rapid sequence of expressions, surprise and something that might have been alarm, and then something that settled into a warmth so open and unguarded that she felt her throat tighten in a way she had not expected. He sat down. He looked at the table. He looked up at her. "In the spring." He said, "March, I think," she said. "I am fairly certain." He stood up again and came around the table and held her carefully and completely, and she felt his hands on her back and his chin against her hair, and he said quietly into her hair, "I was afraid of this." "The baby?" she said. No, he held her closer, being afraid about the baby, being afraid of how much it would matter. He breathed. "It matters considerably." "Yes," she said, "it does." She pressed her face against his shoulder, and thought that this was what she had not written in the letter. When she wrote about sound character and steady disposition, when she described herself with careful pragmatic accuracy to a stranger in Arizona territory. She had not written that she wanted this, not the practical arrangement, not the fair terms, but this specific quality of belonging to something and someone real, this weight of genuine mattering. She was glad she had not written it, because she would not have found words for it then. She had not had the experience of it to draw from. The winter of 1879 was mild, which Cal said with the authority of a man who had spent 20 years in the territory, was unusual and not to be taken for granted, and they took it gratefully. The baby arrived in late March of 1879 in the main room of the ranch house, attended by the Redrock doctor, who was a German man named Brower with large, capable hands, and a practical manner that Susanna found comforting, and by a woman named Maria who lived on the neighboring property and was experienced in these matters, and had been appointed by general consensus to be present. It was a boy. Dexter held him with the combination of absolute care and transparent wonder that very large, generally controlled people sometimes show when faced with very small new things, and Susanna watched from the bed, tired beyond what she had thought tiredness was, and loved them both with a completeness that had no edges. They named him Samuel Langston Finley. Dexter had suggested the middle name, that she keep her name in the child's, that the name not disappear, and she had looked at him and felt, again, that settling of something into rightness that had been the characteristic quality of her life in this place with this person. Samuel was a good-natured baby who became an opinionated small child with dark hair and gray-green eyes, Dexter's eyes in her hair, she noted, and who approached the world with a combination of curiosity and caution that made her think of certain qualities in his father at times and certain qualities in herself at others. Tamaz, who had grown from the boy who drove the wagon to a young man of 19 working full-time at the livery, became an unofficial feature of the ranch on his days off, drawn in by Samuel's popularity and by the general quality of Susanna's cooking. He helped with the horses and with light repairs and ate dinner at the ranch table often enough that she began simply setting a place for him. He was part of what the ranch had become, not just the practical operation it had been when she arrived, but something warmer, a place with a gathering quality that people were comfortable in. Clara Whitmore did become a friend, in the gradual way Susanna had anticipated. Clara married a surveyor named Henry Abbott in the spring of 1880, a quiet, steady man who was exactly right for her in a way that Dexter clearly had never been, and Susanna attended the wedding and was genuinely glad, and afterward told Dexter so, and he said that Henry Abbott was a good man and seemed satisfied by this outcome, and she thought that the whole matter had resolved in exactly the way it should have. The summer of 1880 brought a new development on the water rights front, not from Voss this time, but from the increasing pressure of settlement in the valley. A group of new homesteaders had established claims upstream that were beginning to affect the creek levels in dry months, and there was a meeting at the schoolhouse in Redrock to address it. Susanna went to the meeting with Dexter and sat beside him and listened while various men talked in circles around the actual issue, and then she asked to speak and said, clearly and without raising her voice, that the documented water rights in the valley had a legal hierarchy that could be the basis for a cooperative agreement among all the current users, and that she was willing to assist in drafting that agreement with the input of all parties, and that this was considerably preferable to the alternative of litigation that would be expensive and slow and benefit no one in the valley. There was a silence after she finished, the particular silence of a room of people who have been spoken to sensibly and are recalibrating. Then Beaumont the sheriff, who was still sheriff and who had developed over the past 2 years a healthy respect for Susanna Langston Finley, said that he thought that was a good idea. And then gradually others agreed, and by the end of the evening there was a committee, and Susanna was on it, and within 6 months there was a water agreement for the valley that was the first of its kind in the county, and was eventually used as a model by 2 neighboring counties. Dexter watched all of this with an expression she had come to know well, the combination of pride and amusement and the specific depth of attention that was his particular form of devotion. He said, on the drive home from the signing of the agreement, "You should have been a lawyer." Lawyers in 1880 are not generally women, she said, though I am told this is not an eternal condition. No, he said, I don't imagine it is. He looked at her in the evening light. What would you have done if you had been a man? She thought about it honestly. I think I would have been a very tiresome lawyer, she said, and I would have missed all of this, so I prefer the arrangement. He laughed, and she leaned into his side on the wagon seat. And Samuel, who was a year old and had been carried by Cal to the meeting, and retrieved by Cal from the meeting, and was now asleep in the back of the wagon wrapped in a horse blanket, made a small sound in his sleep that they both looked back at with the automatic reflex of new parents, and then looked at each other, and she felt, precisely as she had felt the first time, the settling of things into rightness. By the fall of 1881, the ranch had grown. Not dramatically, not in the showy way of men who acquired land as a performance of ambition, but steadily and practically, the way things grow when they are tended carefully. They had negotiated the purchase of a section of the east pasture that improved their water access considerably. They had hired 2 additional hands, including a man named Jerome, who was a former Buffalo soldier with exceptional skill with horses, and a manner of calm efficiency that had earned him Cal's high regard, which was not easily earned. They had expanded the stable, and they had built a proper office off the main room of the house, with a desk and good shelving and a window that faced the hills, which was for Susanna's use, where the accounts and correspondence lived, and which had become a room she moved into every morning with something that was simply happiness. Samuel was walking and attempting to run, which meant the entire property was now theoretically in danger, and had developed a vocabulary of approximately 40 words which he deployed with conviction, if not always accuracy. Dexter read to him in the evenings, which had begun as a practical act, and had become something she watched with a full heart. The large man and the small child on the old horsehair sofa, the lamplight, the book, the total absorbed attention that Samuel gave to his father's voice. She was pregnant again by November of 1881. This time she told him in the evening on the porch, with a cup of coffee in her hand and the cold, clear winter stars beginning above the hills, and she said it the same way she said most things, and this time his response was immediate. He set down his cup and took her hand and held it without saying anything for a moment, and then said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "Good." He held her hand. "Good." The second child, born in July of 1882, was a girl. They named her Alice Ruth Alice because they both liked it, and Ruth because Susanna had decided, with careful thought, that it was the right thing to carry forward, that the woman Dexter had been married to before deserved to be remembered in their family rather than buried by it, that the naming was a form of honesty, and that she was not afraid of the honesty. Dexter had looked at her when she suggested it, had been very quiet for a long moment, and then had said, with a voice that was slightly unsteady, that yes, he thought that was right. Alice Ruth Finley was, from the beginning, formidably strong-willed, which Cal observed was what happened when both parents were formidably strong-willed, and the apple fell directly under the tree. She was also, from the beginning, adored by Samuel, who was 3 when she arrived and was initial suspicious, and within a week completely devoted, by Tamaz, who remained a fixture of the ranch, and who held her with the careful reverence of a very young man who is aware of his own inexperience, by every hand on the property, and by Susanna and Dexter, who navigated the new exhaustion and new joy of a second child, with the same combination of practical competence and genuine love that characterized most of what they did together. The years moved forward in the way years do when life is full, not quickly exactly, not the blurred rush of unhappy times when you are trying to survive them, but with the satisfying weight of time that is well used. There were hard seasons, a cattle illness in 1883 that cost them significantly, a drought in 1884 that required every creative solution they could find, and tested the Valley Water Agreement to its limits before the rains finally came. The death of Cal in the winter of 1885 from a heart complaint that was sudden and that hit Dexter hard, and which Susanna helped him through the way he had helped her through various things, by being present, by being honest, by not pretending that hard things were not hard. Jerome was made foreman after Cal, which was the right choice, and was received without objection by the other hands, which Susanna thought said something about both Jerome and the quality of people on the ranch. There was a brief complicated period in 1884 when a new law affecting territorial land holdings created uncertainty about some aspects of their deed, and Susanna spent 6 months corresponding with Mr. Barclay in Tucson, and eventually with a land office in Washington, and resolved it in a way that Barclay called formidably thorough, which she considered one of the better compliments she had received. Samuel started school in Redrock in 1884 and approached it with the same combination of his father's carefulness and his mother's directness that made him interesting to his teachers and probably occasionally exhausting. He was good with numbers, which made Susanna feel a specific and perhaps immodest satisfaction. He was also, Dexter observed one evening, going to be a great deal taller than both of them, which was turning out to be true. Alice was not particularly interested in the formal school curriculum, but was extremely interested in the horses and in the practical operations of the ranch. And by the time she was 4, she was following Jerome around the stable with a proprietary air that he appeared to find amusing and appropriate. And Susanna thought that this, too, was telling her something about the shape of the future. In the spring of 1886, on an April evening much like the April evening of their first acknowledgment of love by the south fence, Dexter and Susanna sat on the porch of the ranch house in the late light and looked out at the property that had been, for almost 8 years now, theirs. Samuel was inside doing his reading. Alice was asleep, finally, after an evening of vigorous resistance to the concept of bedtime. The hills were the color of old copper in the evening light, and the air had the particular quality of an Arizona spring, clear and warm, and carrying the smell of the desert after recent rain. Susanna had been thinking, as she sometimes did in these quiet moments, about the woman who had stepped off the stage in Redrock 8 years ago with a traveling bag and $2.63, and a carefully practical letter of introduction and no illusions. That woman had been right about most things, about the value of directness, about the danger of managed expectations, about the importance of honesty in transactions of every kind. But she had been wrong about one thing, and it was the thing she had been most certain of, the conviction she had carried like a shield. She had believed with the authority of repeated experience that wanting something real from a person was a form of vulnerability that would be used against you. She had been wrong about that entirely. "What are you thinking?" Dexter said, which was a question he asked sometimes in these quiet evenings, and which she answered honestly as she answered most things. "I was thinking about the advertisement," she said. He glanced at her. "Which part?" "The last line," she said. "No romantic illusions." "I remember writing that," he said. "I wrote it because I meant it at the time." "And now," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was going to say something true. "Now," he said, "I think I was wrong about illusions. I thought wanting something real was a form of illusion, that believing a thing could be genuinely good was the same as being naive about it. I was wrong. This is not an illusion." He looked at her. "This is the most actual thing in my life." Susanna felt the warmth of it move through her the way warmth moves through a house in winter, into all the corners, steady and complete. "You know," she said, "when I arrived here I told myself I was being practical, that this was a transaction with clear terms and manageable stakes. I told myself that every day for the first 2 weeks." "When did you stop telling yourself that?" he asked. She considered. "The night the lamp guttered and you put your hand over mine," she said. "I stopped telling myself that on the walk back to my room, though I continued trying to believe it for several more days out of stubbornness." He laughed, low and genuine. I stopped believing it the morning you told Voss you couldn't invite him inside, he said. When Tamaz told me he had come back from town early and he saw the whole thing, he told me at dinner. I sat with it for the rest of the evening. You didn't say anything, she said. I didn't know what to say. He turned to look at her fully. I knew I was in trouble. Were you frightened, she said. Considerably, he said. Less than I would have been before you arrived. You had been gradually reducing my fear for 6 weeks at that point, I believe, without my fully noticing. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I should add that to my list of services, she said. Fear reduction. Gradual and largely incidental. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, unhurried and certain. You have been exactly right, he said quietly to her hair. From the moment you stepped off that stage, I should have found a way to say that sooner. You said it when it mattered most, she said. When I had the bag in my hand and was leaving, you said it then and I put the bag down. You put the bag down, he agreed. She thought about that moment, the doorway, the lantern, the wind, the words that had held her at the edge of departure and turned her back into the house and into the conversation that had made everything else possible. The wrong woman, the right moment. The collision of those two things that had produced this specific and unrepeatable life. She had come here with no illusions and had found something better than illusions. The steady daily weight of a real thing, real work, real home, real children, real love that was not the performed variety or the compensatory variety or the variety that existed to fill a space, but the kind that grows from genuine knowledge of a person, that is built from 10,000 ordinary moments and the trust that accumulates in them. She was not the wrong woman anymore. She had not been the wrong woman for 8 years, and the proof was in the accounts she kept, the acres she rode, the children she had named, the man whose shoulder she was leaning against in the copper and amber evening while the hills went dark and the stars came up over Arizona, the same stars that had been there when she arrived, watching. She thought the stars were better now, actually. Or maybe she was simply better at seeing them. They sat on the porch until full dark, until the lamp in the window behind them was the warmest light in a wide, cold-starred world, and the night was utterly quiet except for the crickets and a horse moving in the stable and Samuel's voice drifting out faintly from inside the house, reading aloud to himself the way he did, working his way through the words with Dexter's deliberate care and Susanna's conviction, and Alice making a small sound in her room that settled back into silence. The house was full. The land was theirs. The water ran clear in the agreements they had built. The fence lines held. Dexter's hand found hers in the dark of the porch and held it, and she held back. And that was everything. Not the absence of difficulty or the end of work or the guarantee of easy seasons ahead, but this. Knowing who was next to you in the dark and knowing it fully and being exactly, undeniably, permanently right.